But we also have over 180 agreements between industry and Aboriginal communities. And last year alone, Aboriginal business in Canada contributed $32 billion to the Canadian economy. So this is something to be proud of, and I think that we've come a long way. Last year, mining as an industry took over the Canadian government as the #1 employer of Aboriginal people in Canada. And so as you can see, there are partnerships being forged, and we are trying to figure out how to do it better. So after working in Latin America for more than a decade, I realized there are needs by communities, companies, and governments to see what's possible and see a different approach, and also for tools to be able to help implement some of these better practices. So what we do is we share stories such as Jerry's story and others to show what's possible and help in bringing some of these tools to the table to help companies and communities implement these better practices. So what we want to do today with you is share two stories, two case studies, one from Canada, which will be the Tahltan Nation, which Jerry will share, and that's his story of taking his community from 98% unemployment to 0. And then we'd like to share a story from Peru and how we've started working for the last 2 years with a Canadian mining company and local community to implement some of these best practices on the ground, and how we have managed to be able to move that forward and shift some of the mindsets around what's possible in the business sector and the mining space down there. So with that, I will turn it over to Jerry to take us through the first case study.
Good morning. Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Jeff, for inviting me. And I want to tell you the story about my nation. As you can see by the map, we're up in northwestern British Columbia, and we're into the Yukon. Our territory is 97,500 square miles, or 150,000 square kilometers. Next slide, Sonia. This picture is my fish camp, where the Tahltan River runs into the Stickeen. That big bluff you see has an eagle that spreads his wings for 400 feet across the face of that bluff. Very religious, very ceremonial place for the Tahltan people. Next is Sonia. In the winter of 83-84, we had 98% unemployment in the winter, and we had 65% unemployment in the summer. We had 80% of our members were on welfare. We had high serious alcohol and drug problems. We had a high suicide rate. We had low education standards. In 2006, when I was chief, we had 95% employment in the winter and 100% in the summer. Next slide. We trained 21 journeyman carpenters in 5 years. We 6 welders. We have many more now. 3 heavy-duty mechanics. Lots and lots of equipment and heavy operators and truck drivers. 3 chefs. One of our chefs works in Whistler, which is a big resort in British Columbia. We had lots of trainees. Just office staff. Just keep flipping them, Sonia. Office managers, camp managers, and between 98 and 2008, we introduced alcohol and drug program. Our suicide rate went to 0. People on welfare were single mothers, handicapped, and elders. And in the fiscal year of 2004-5 and 5 and 6, I was one of the only chiefs in Canada that had to return thousands of dollars from my welfare program to the government of Canada because I couldn't spend it. So the quite big question is, how did we do it? It was pretty simple. Our methodology was very simple. We had a vision, we had a strategy, and then we needed a vehicle to carry that vision to fruition. So our strategy was we didn't want to work with the old Indian Affairs model of jobs and training. We needed a nation-building model. So we had to look off reserve, and we had to develop a vehicle. We knew that mom-and-pop businesses such as gas stations, grocery stores, while they'll make an individual family wealthy or give them affluent lifestyle, it didn't work for a nation. It was not a nation builder. And we understood we left the bush economy. The bush economy was gone forever. So we had to enter the wage economy. And so that's where we looked. So in 1984, January 85, the chief of the Tahltan negotiated to build the first 10 modern homes Telegraph Creek. And he came to Whitehorse, where I was working as a business service officer. And so we met and talked, and I said to him, "Who is building these houses for you?" And he said, "We haven't picked a contractor yet." So out of the blue, I said, "Why don't we start a company and build these houses ourselves?" So that was in the afternoon, and that evening he phoned me. He said, "I'd like to see you tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock for breakfast down at the Yukon Inn, and we'll talk about this." So I went down there, and we discussed this. And he said to me, "Can you put this company together and then present it to our chief and our council and the other board of directors?" And I said, "Sure, I'll do that. But I want to show you some of the houses and why he was so adamant about building new homes." So you can just flip through these, Sonia. Just flip through them. And so we decided that in April 5th, 1985, I went down and presented what was called the Tahltan Native Development Corporation. And our people didn't like that name, nation, our native, sorry. They said we're a nation. So we changed the name to Tahltan Nation Development Corporation. And that was a vehicle we planned to use to move forward to our put our strategy into play. And so Chief Patazursa from the Iska Tahltan negotiated to build 50 houses over 5 years. You can start flipping through them. So we built 30 homes in Telegraph. We built the new band office. We built the fire hall. We expanded the store. We built a new health center for Health Canada. That's in Telegraph Creek. In Dease Lake, we built the office shop complex. That's for TNDC. We built 8 houses for a housing society. We built 10 houses on our own reserve. We built a new Stickeen Health Center for Health Canada. In Iskut, we built 50 houses. We also built their new administration building. But at the time, we knew this. Go ahead, flip some more, Sonia. We knew that we still needed a something off reserve because the reserve economy wouldn't give us our nation building strategy. So we looked at the mining, forestry, and hydro development off reserve. Go ahead. But before we negotiated anything, in April of 1987, we wrote the Tahltan Resource Development Policy. And it was a very simple policy. It only had 8 points, but it was the basis for all negotiations for the Tahltan Nation from that day forward. So number one, the policy says there shall be no threat of irreparable environmental damage. Number two, the development will not jeopardize or prejudice the outstanding land rights of the Tahltan people. 3, assurance that it provide more positive than negative social impact. 4, provided for the widest possible education and direct employment related training. 5, provide for the widest employment opportunity for our people. 6, provide for an equity participation in their projects. And this is very important. We're going to come back to that later. 7, provide for the widest possible Tahltan business opportunities. And 8, simply said that we expected a developer to assist us to accomplish these objectives. So that was our resource development policy. And so that's what I used as a backdrop to negotiate. And the first negotiation was with the Golden Bear Mine. Home State Canada was the company that we negotiated with. And one of the things that's a problem being a native that was new, we had problems negotiating because they wouldn't give us contracts. This was mainly a socioeconomic agreement. It was the first one in British Columbia, fourth in all of Canada, but it did have contracting opportunities. And coming back to those, the company said you need a track record. We don't know what you can do. And one of the problems of being a new Aboriginal company, there are stereotypes that we have. Go ahead, Sonia. They thought that, for this agreement, we bought $3 million worth of equipment. I negotiated with the Native Economic Development Program for $1.8 million. And then I borrowed $1.2 million from the equipment dealer. And I negotiated a 3-year agreement, operating and maintenance on that 100-mile road. But before they gave us that, you can flip again, they thought that Aboriginal people knew how to do fancy beadwork and carve totem poles. Well, it's true our Tahltan women know how to do fancy beadwork, but Tahltan never carved totem poles. If we wanted them, we bought them. And so I looked for a track record. I went to a company called Grant Stewart Construction. We signed a joint venture, and we negotiated the first contract. You can go ahead, Sonia, with the settling pond. You can flip it again. Then we negotiated a 5-year open pit mining contract. And go ahead. And then we had the 3-year upgrading and maintenance contract on the road. We did about 80% of the site work. We did about 75% of the mill. Go ahead. When by 1991, TNDC was the largest native-owned and operated heavy construction company in Western Canada. And so, go ahead. The agreement said there was a 20% employment target. In actual fact, we end up with 39% of the workforce, 75% of the employment for contractors. And in most mines, they have a very high turnover rate. The Tahltan turnover rate was only 2 to 4% per year. So just to show you that we were not only looking at economics, we looked at the environment. The road was going to go through a valley called the Shelby Valley. And there's only about 3 Class A winter moose habitat areas in British Columbia. Shelby Valley is one of those. Go ahead. And then it was also a very large spawning area for sockeye salmon. And because of the salmon, it was one of the largest concentrations of inland grizzlies in British Columbia. So we didn't want these bears slaughtered. We didn't want our moose habitat destroyed by the road, so we changed it. And in 1989, Tahltan Nation Development Corporation and Tahltan Central Council received the BC Environmental Award for rerouting that road. Our next project was the Escray Creek Mine. Between 1990 and 2008, we built a 68-kilometer road with a joint venture with Ledcor. We constructed the camp, the site work, constructed the mill, all the earthworks. We negotiated a long-term maintenance contract. Go ahead, Sonia. And we negotiated an agreement with Aero Transport to do the ore haul and the backhaul. We did Sputsy Remote Services, which is a catering, housekeeping, security company. We did all the work on that. We had 42% of employment in the whole mine. And between 1990 and 2008, we did over $200 million in contracts. Go ahead. The next project was Galore Creek, which was supposed to be a really big mine. Between 2006 and 2008, we had negotiated $176 million in contracts. Individual Tahltan had over $30 million in contracts. And unfortunately, Tech shut that project down after two years. So we never did bring those to fruition. Dewey Lakes Hydro. It was the first independent power project owned by an Aboriginal group in British Columbia. We negotiated an agreement with BC Hydro. It was to take the town of Dease Lake off of diesel generation. Small project, 3 megawatts, but with built so it can expand to 6 megawatts if we decide if the grid comes in and we can sell into the grid. So it was for 2 megawatt sales for 20 years. Go ahead. The next big project was Alta Gas, and that is a B, $1.2 billion. A Forest Kerr Hydro project. That tunnel is 80 feet high, 25 meters, 3.2 kilometers long. And we did a joint venture with Procon Mining. Alta Gas has 3 projects. They have the Forest Kerr, 198 megawatts, McClymont Creek, 68, and Volcano, 38 megawatts. And from those, we negotiated agreements. We signed the agreement on May the 9th. And in British Columbia, they have what's called the BC Clean Energy Act. And because we're an unceded land, we haven't settled land claim, BC government agreed to pay us for rents for land and water. And the agreement was $2.5 million a year. And because they signed an agreement with Alta Gas for 60 years, we also demanded a contract for 60 years. And so you can flip to the next one. One of the big things we had in we received our first check on December the 12th, 2014, and it was for $500,000. And so one of our agreements was we could invest back into the Volcano Creek project, and they would pay us, go ahead, Sonia. They would pay us 7.95% interest for 60 years. So if you know what the interest rates are today, we negotiated this back in the day when the interest rates were high. So they gave us this first check, and so we immediately invested it back in. So then they started figuring it out. They said, listen, if you put $2 million in, every 10 years it doubles. So in 10 years, you have 4 million, 20 years, 8 million, 30 years, 16 million, 40 years, 32 million, 40 years, 64 million, 50 years, you got 128 million. So they said, listen, this is not a tentative deal for us. We'll tell you what, you give us a 2 million, and we will then start a joint venture company, and we will own the Volcano Creek 50-50. So we agreed. So the company Volcano Creek Limited Partnership is totally owned by Cold Mountain Hydro, which is a 100% owned subsidiary of AltaGas, and the Tahltan Heritage Trust now own that. The Tahltan Heritage Trust invested the $2 million into it. So we own the Volcano Creek 50-50. That's where the equity participation comes in. The next big project is the transmission line into our country. That's what it looks like now. Go ahead, Sonia. And the big mine we have operating today is the Red Chris. You can keep going. Go ahead. So one of the things that's happened in British Columbia is the provincial government agreed to share the taxes from these mines and from hydro or development or forestry. So right now, our share from the province of BC for AltaGas is 1.48 million. And then from Red Chris Mine is 208,000. Go ahead. So these are from the proponent. We also negotiate with the proponent. Galore Creek still pays us 291,000, about 300,000 a year goes into the trust. Red Chris pays us 300,000, and AltaGas pays us 2.2 million. So just over 2 million. And so our grand total last year was $4,613,045 from these revenues. We put 2.673 million into the Heritage Trust, and our trust today sits at 9.6 million. Go ahead. So where are we today? In June 30, 2016, we opened up a brand new office shop complex. Go ahead, Sonia. That building today is worth 5.3 million. And the thing about it that's so great is Tahltan didn't borrow $1 to build that. We started at the top, $300,000 project. Today it's 5.3 million. And we don't earn anybody 5 cents. These are actual figures. Our revenue is only from TNDC, 18.7 million. But the wages are from our subsidiary as well, because that all goes through TNDC. Our joint venture partners wouldn't allow me to put the gross money up there from all of our joint ventures. You could rest assured it'd be a lot more than 18.7 million. 85% of our employees are Tahltan. We have 8 divisions, 27 joint ventures. We have aviation, construction, communication, environment, camp services, transportation and fuel, drilling and blasting, and engineering division. Go ahead. Here are just some of our pictures. We have $11.5 million worth of equipment paid for. Our environmental company. This is one of the best logos and one of the best companies that we own, because we do all of the big background baseline work for every project in our country. I love this logo. I think it's one of our best. Go ahead. We own 49% of Pacific Coastal Airlines. Go ahead. We own 49% of the helicopter company. We own 51% of North Rock Drilling and Blasting. And our investments in August 2015, the Tahltan bought $1.6 million from a $30 million debenture that Imperial Metals, the owner of Red Chris Mine, put out. So we make 6% per annum, paid semi-annually, and it matures in August 25th, 2021, and we'll receive our $1.6 million back. Go ahead. And the BC Aboriginal Business Award, Tahltan Nation Development Corporation was named the Aboriginal Business, go ahead, Sonia, for the year 2015. Go ahead. And so I leave you with this message. If the Tahltan can go from 98% unemployment to zero, any Indigenous community can do it. Any community. And all you need is a methodology, vision, strategy, and a vehicle. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jerry. That's a really inspiring story. We'll turn it back to Sonia in just a minute, just a quick comment. I mean, this is the reason why we thought this would be such an exciting webinar to hold is because, you know, there's definitely perhaps a lack of imagination sometimes in many resource development projects that think that, you know, that local communities can't do it. But as the story shows that not only can local procurement happen, it can also happen in a way that involves equity and all sorts of really extensive economic benefits long beyond just the actual procurement. So I'll turn it over to Sonia now to talk about what they're doing to take these lessons elsewhere.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. Thank you, Jerry. So 2 years ago, we went down to Peru, and we had started taking these practices around to see if this was something that could be translatable. Oftentimes people say, you know, now that we have laws in Canada and a legal system that supports much more active participation by Aboriginal people in resource development and in local procurement, that is the first thing that governments and companies say, that, you know, it's a different context in Canada and this can't work anywhere else. And we're very quick to say that, you know, 30 years ago when Jerry was getting started with this, the laws in Canada were very different. The laws did not encourage, in fact, discouraged Aboriginal participation. We still had residential schools. You know, there were still things that were really contrary to supporting Aboriginal economic empowerment. And so those laws have changed over time, and they have progressed with the progression of business and Aboriginal involvement, frankly, over time. And so really it has to start somewhere. So we were very fortunate to have a Canadian company, Hudbay, interested in trying to see if this model would work in Peru. And they were just moving from development to operations. And so this was a really critical time and a great opportunity because their contracts were now coming up for rebidding and transitioning to long-term contracts. Yes, it was Hudbay in Peru. So they just started operations at their Constancia project in Cusco. And so about 2 years ago, we came on and we signed an agreement with the communities operating near their project, and with Hudbay to help see if we could bridge this and facilitate some of these tools into practice. And so we looked at what contracts were coming up and immediately noticed that the catering contract was coming up for rebidding, and they were open to looking at new contractors for that long-term contract. And from our perspective, you know, catering is always a great place to start because it has a number of entry-level positions that communities already have some level of skills to participate in. And there's a lot of training opportunities and advancement opportunities for the communities, and so it's always a great one to look at. And in these communities in particular, they already had small restaurants, bakeries, and hotels that they were running, and so they had some level of knowledge in those areas. So where to start? You know, this wasn't something that had been tried in Peru before, and not a lot of people were familiar with the concept of a joint venture partnership. And so we thought, okay, you know, if we're going to do this, let's see what we need. So really there were three parts to the puzzle. First, it was convincing Hudbay to support a joint venture. So not just the typical, big contractor with some subcontracting and employment opportunities, but actually a shared partnership for a joint venture. Organizing the community enterprise to separate church and state, because many of the community enterprises in Peru operate under a different legal system where the political and the corporate entities are one, and that leads to a lot of corruption, and business just can't be done that way. And then third, to find a good joint venture partnership and convince them that the Canadian model and these practices that we've sort of developed over the last few decades might be something worth taking a chance on. So those are the three things that we sat down with. We started with working with Hudbay, meeting with their directors at the higher levels in management locally. They liked the idea, although this was something that hadn't been done before, and they weren't sure how this was going to play out in practice. Their biggest issues were liability, of course, taking on a big risk to give such a big contract to communities. Ultimately, their people, their staff need to eat in order for the mine to operate. They don't want sick people coming to work or missing work. And there were just issues with keeping their staff happy and making sure things flowed properly to keep their operations running, especially in the early years when things were just getting started. So those are some of the concerns we had to deal with. One of the ways we got them comfortable with the risk was that in many of the joint venture partnerships in Canada, yes, it starts out as a 50-50 partnership or 49-51, but the community enterprise would give the experienced company a management contract in order to manage for the first 5 years the contract. And so the community would learn how to operate and own and take on the risk and responsibility of a big contract through training at those higher levels, but ultimately, the management would sit with the experienced corporate partner until the community enterprise would learn those positions. And so ultimately, one of the biggest benefits we had was that the general manager at Hudbay had international experience, as did the procurement lead. And so they both understood internally the value of local procurement and the benefit and cost savings over time to their operations. And since they were just starting and we're going to have 22 years plus, it made a good case for investing in their future. Ultimately, it was an investment in training, and they really wanted their biggest selling feature for Hudbay was that they wanted their communities to learn business and not just be given handouts of subcontracts and things, small local businesses and things, which are fine, as Jerry said, for some families, but ultimately it's not going to lift an entire community out of poverty. And they ultimately, wanted to see extreme poverty being eradicated along with the mine, and saw that there could be benefits both for Hudbay and for the communities in helping them to learn business in the real way and taking on some risk as well. One of the things was, if you're going to learn business, business comes with risk and responsibility. And so ownership is a key part of that. And that's the value that learning how to do a joint venture brings. So Hudbay wanted to keep its tendering process open and competitive. So in the end, we decided on a 30-point system out of 100 that would go to community participation. And then this would incentivize the market to partner with the communities. There was not a lot of interest in the market, a lot of discrimination in the market, the business place, frankly, in South America around rural communities and Indigenous participation, and just a lot of stereotypes, as Jerry mentioned, around what communities were capable of doing and their level of participation. And so there needed to be some sort of an incentive to encourage the market to actively seek out involvement at a higher level with the community businesses. And so we felt that could be achieved through changing the point system in their tendering process in order to send a message to the market that, they're taking local procurement seriously and they want to see, active participation from the community businesses. And so they're, putting their money where their mouth is in that sense. So that was a long process. That took 6 months or so. And meanwhile, we were also working with the communities to help them strengthen their local community enterprise to be a corporation that could actually enter into a partnership with a large corporation and provide services at that level. And once we were done with those initial workshops and structuring, we supported the community to send letters to. We got a list of preferred contractors from Hudbay, and we sent a letter to their top four, inviting them to a conversation about a potential joint venture partnership with the community business. And so the community set out in its letter that it was inviting each of these companies to a meeting to discuss a joint venture that would consist of a 50-50 partnership with a management contract going to the company, extensive training and capacity building at all levels, and opportunities for advancement, and subcontracting and employment opportunities. And so that was sort of what the framework was that the communities were looking for in a partner. And we invited these top four companies to come to the table and see what they could propose. One of the biggest obstacles for the working with the community in this process was for them to really understand that this opportunity was not about the money, that it was about the training. They were going to be learning how to manage and run a big business and a big contract, and they were going to get incredible training and skills through that it wasn't a windfall opportunity of a contract that was going to bring them lots of revenue, because they weren't going to be making a lot of money, and at least initially, with the management contract going to the big company. But what they would get is, a lot of training, a lot of jobs, and a lot of opportunity to then apply those skills to other contracts, and hopefully in 5 to 7 years be able to take on more of a leadership role in that contract. So it was really about the training. Ultimately, 2 companies out of the 4 came back with proposals to the community, and we met with both of them extensively and discussed their proposals. One was an international company, and one was a local Peruvian company. On one of our trips to Canada with the Peruvian leaders, on our exchange trips, we actually introduced the community leaders to the head office, the head people in Canada of the international company, and they met and had really interesting conversations. And the international head of the company was very interested. They have done dozens of joint ventures around the world and know the model very well. The challenge we had was that it hadn't been done in Peru before, and so there was a really big obstacle in shifting that mindset about what was possible and what the communities were capable of doing, and why it was important to share, ultimately, the contract. And so that was probably the biggest hurdle we had to overcome. We spent a lot of time in meetings discussing how this would play out, how a joint venture would play out. The company was really concerned about the risk in taking on a big contract with Hudbay and not being able to deliver on the services because the communities weren't able to meet their obligations. The biggest conversation we had was around timing, and the company wanted to have a guarantee from Hudbay before they entered into an agreement with the community to guarantee them that they would get the contract in order to put in the time to develop an agreement with the communities. Ultimately, Hudbay wanted to keep the process open, but ultimately what we said was, 30 points out of 100 is going to tip the scales. So whoever signs an agreement with the communities essentially is not outright guaranteed the contract, but everything else being equal, if you meet the experience and the costs and things, then it's quite likely that you're going to get it. So ultimately, the biggest challenge was them trying to understand why it was important to enter into an agreement with the communities first and develop a proposal jointly to present to Hudbay, rather than getting the contract first and then subcontracting opportunities to the community later. And again, this goes back to the ownership and teaching the communities to be owners and giving them the opportunity to be part of the decision-making process, which is really vital in building those long-term partnerships. So ultimately, what it took was two things to get them really on board. The first was the general manager of Hud Bay in a meeting after about 8 months of back and forth and meetings and discussions and going around in circles on this. The general manager finally saying, okay, listen, this is what we're doing. This is going to happen. This is what we want to do. So take it or leave it. There'll be other companies who are interested. And he got up and he left. And so that was sort of drawing the line and really making the point that we are committed to local procurement, and that's what's happening. So get on board or get out the door. And so after that, of course, they were on board, and conversations went a lot quicker. Still, there was, we could tell while they were on board, didn't really understand how it was going to play out in practice. And that was going to be a challenge for implementation. So we really needed them to really not only be on board, but get it and be behind it to make it work. So on a trip to Canada, the general manager of this company, of this catering company, visited Tahltan country and visited some of their own projects in joint ventures in Canada and with Aboriginal communities, and were able to see firsthand how it works and that it's been successful over the last 20 years, and it has brought benefits to both the company and the community. And so from there, it flowed much easier, being able to see that it's possible. So in the end, we settled on a slightly progressive model of a joint venture where the community is still a co-owner of the contract, but it takes over leadership as they are ready. It's training heavy, and we really pushed for this company, even though, I think there was some ups and downs with this company. We really were behind them being the ultimate partner because they had such great training programs and such a great track record of supporting community development. Ultimately, we're still in the process, and it's still not a done deal. It's been about 1.5 years, and we're at the stage now of negotiating and putting together the proposal and the agreement between the partners. But the hard work has been done for the most part, because really it was the shift in mindset to be able to see what's possible and be able to bring these parties together to actually take the leap forward and create this change in the marketplace that many people didn't believe was possible. Ultimately, what was the key to success here, I think, was having a champion at the top in each organization to push it forward. Even though in this company it took some time to get that champion on board. Once we got a champion, we had one in Hud Bay, and we had one at the company and in the community, and we were able to get a lot more done that way. So really making sure that the people at the top understand the values of local procurement and are able to push for it was a huge success for us. So that's our story, just briefly for Peru. We're still working on it, and it's not the end of the race yet, but we're hopeful that we're going to be able to have a successful example to show in Peru that this can work elsewhere.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Sonia and Gary. Again, it's exciting to hear some of the actual practical steps taken, because I think most people on this webinar will probably already know a lot of the basic approaches to increasing local procurement, but it really gets into the meat of how to set up those joint ventures, some of those keys to management, attitude shifts, which actually make these things happen. So really excited to hear your story, and we'll turn to questions. It'd be great to hear people's reactions to Jerry and Sonia's presentation and questions. So just remember, if you're muted, you're going to have to unmute your mic to ask a question. So we'll just, whoever gets there first can go.
Hi, Jeff. Silvana. I'm here with Javier and 3 from Washington, the World Bank. I'd say this is a very fascinating story. Both stories are quite interesting, and it actually calls for a lot more discussion than what was presented. Having worked across, let's say, many communities in many countries, the team here cannot notice that perhaps in the stories there is also an important component regarding the culture of the communities affected, and that perhaps the community in Canada had as a start a very business-like mentality. So the ability to negotiate, the openness to negotiate, and that's independently of having something to trade into those joint ventures that they were so successful in negotiating. There is probably, I mean, I don't know if Sonia perhaps can comment, since my understanding is that she also worked with the Tahltan community. So perhaps in the two experiences between Peru and the Yukon, maybe she can identify things that are different within the two communities and that justifies a slightly different model. It seems to us that this is a slightly different model, where initially the Tahltan community has a model of direct equity participation, building a nation, low in training, if you wish, like training on the job once you secure a good joint venture. While the second approach is we negotiated a good training arrangement. We didn't have the same advantages through trading. Let's say every situation obviously requires a slightly different approach. And it would be interesting to hear from the presenters what they think are the main differences that justifies a change in model.
Thank you for that. I'll just speak briefly to that, and then I'll turn it over to Jerry, because I think he was also working with us in Peru, and so he might be able to shed some light on that as well. And I agree with you completely. Every case is different, and ultimately what we have developed is just simply tools that we help communities implement themselves. Ultimately we share the tools, and we support them to make their own decisions and to create their own models of what's going to work in their context, because of course we can't propose to know what is going to work for one or the other, or what community wants to achieve versus another. So these are simply tools that can be adapted to any context, and so in this case the agreement is different. They had some businesses, the community already had some businesses going in these areas, and so they wanted to start with catering. And in Jerry's community, they had very little skills, but they knew how to build houses, and so they started with building houses, which had nothing to do with mining. They didn't have mining yet in their territory, and they needed to get a foot into the economy. So really what we help communities do is to find that one area that is their lowest hanging fruit to get themselves into training and the local economy. So as you see in the Tahltan experience, they started building houses because that's what they knew. And from there, they used that money and those skills to apply it to other contracts in mining and forestry and hydro, et cetera. And using that capital to also invest in getting equipment to build their business, to grow, et cetera. In Peru, they already had a mine for many years in that area, and they had some experience in restaurants and hotels and things like that. Minimal experience, but that was what they could start with. And so we looked at where they can begin, that is the lowest hanging fruit, in order to be able to get into the local economy and build those skills that could be transferable to other areas, and to also get some experience in managing those kinds of contracts. So of course every community is different, and in other communities we've worked with, they want to look at completely different things, and ultimately it's looking at where they can begin. They have to start somewhere if they're interested in doing business in mining, and if they're not, then there's other areas in tourism and agriculture that they can also begin. So we've also helped them in agriculture and other areas, and that's been interesting because that dovetails very nicely with catering, being able to have an agricultural program that these communities are really tied to be able to develop organics and things like that to supply to the mine. So I don't know, Jerry, did you want to touch on maybe some of the differences that you noticed?
Well, I want to tell you exactly what I said to the resource developers when they first came into our country. If you're here to leave me with poison water and roads that open up the country and people slaughter my game, and you're going to poison the air and cause me all these headaches and come into my communities and bring alcohol and drugs, and I'm having problems now with my children, my young girls are getting pregnant, etc., etc. I don't need it. Stay away. Now, if you want to talk to me about building better infrastructure, better roads, better education, better health facilities, train my people to get these jobs, meaningful jobs, not labor jobs, and if you're going to leave my water pure, you're going to put a gate on your roads so nobody goes in and slaughters my game, let's talk. And that's exactly what they want in Peru. No difference. So even though we're different, we're the same. And the whole point of this is just a methodology of growing to where they want to or reaching their vision may differ from mine. But the basic vision and the wants are identical. And like Sonia said, sometimes it's agricultural, sometimes it's tourism, sometimes it's something else. It doesn't have to be mining. It doesn't have to be hydro. But the base is exactly the same. This is where they want to get to.
Jerry, Sonia, thanks very much for the answer. And we appreciate your enthusiasm with this, but can we just, can you be a bit more precise as to, in your opinion, what institutional or cultural features, besides everyone wanted the same thing, of course we do, what are, in your opinion, the most relevant cultural and institutional elements that allow such a vision to take place?
Jerry, did you want to touch on that one, or do you want me to?
You go ahead. I don't quite understand that question.
Just, I think she's asking in terms of what features in a community are necessary, or we have seen that can allow something like this to happen.
Well, let me tell you from the Tahltan point of view. We were sick and tired of being sick and tired. 98% unemployment, high welfare, suicide, 3 to 5 suicides in a little community a year, lots and lots of pregnant teenagers, etc., etc. We had enough of it. We were beggars in our own land, so we decided to take it back. That was a motivating factor for the Tahltan. And it was only 5 people who decided in the beginning. Others got on board, but started with 5 of us. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that's...
Maybe I can elaborate on that a little bit. One thing, and I think it's a really good question, one thing that we have seen is people willing to lead, whether it doesn't necessarily have to be the formal leaders in the community, but people who are interested in actually taking this on and having the patience and the resilience to stick with it. I mean, a year and a half is a long time to just be sitting and going back and forth and negotiating from a community's perspective who are farmers and are used to working the land and may not understand all the nuances of the negotiations. And so to be able to have the vision of what Jerry said of where you want to get to and thinking long term. And that was one of the biggest challenges, and we've seen this across many communities, is the ability to see where you want to get to in 20 years and commit to doing that. And so what we've started doing is bringing a group of leaders every year from these communities in Peru to Canada, and spending a week with First Nations communities, with on resource projects and environmental remediation sites, and seeing firsthand what's possible in the long term, so that they can have a better vision for where they might want to go. Being able to, some communities in this area have had more success with this than others, and even as you said, there's differences in cultures between countries and also within nations and tribes and villages, and some communities are very pro-business and want to develop business and understand business, and some are not, and some are farmers and want to have their agriculture and their dairy farms. And what we've learned to do is really just ultimately support whatever it is their vision is. So one of the communities in the immediate area of influence is very business focused, and they are the ones negotiating this contract, and they want a joint venture. The other community in the direct area of influence are all dairy farmers, and they have absolutely no idea about business. They're learning, and they'd like to learn, but they're dairy farmers. And so we've started organic dairy projects with them and tied that to the joint venture to supply products. So so there's ways to work with all different cultural experiences in order to ultimately help them reach their visions. But I agree with you. I mean, it really is looking at case by case and supporting communities in being able to reach whatever vision it is that they have for their future.
Great. Other questions?
Thank you, guys. A quick question is, could you tell us in absolute numbers the population of the community in British Columbia that was involved in this? And does it make a difference in organizing the community between a small versus a large community in terms of being able to negotiate and all that? Thank you.
The Tahltans are a very large nation. There's about 6,000 of us. There's about 375 people live in Telegraph Creek, about 450 in Iskut, and about 300 Tahltans in Beast Lake. There are about 1,000 Tahltan in our territory, but we have 5,000 other Tahltans scattered around the world. And the Tahltan central government looks after those people. We have two bands, a Tahltan band and Iskut band, under the Indian Act, and they can look after the business on reserve. The Tahltan central government looks after all of our land claims and everything else outside. The Tahltan Nation Development Corporation is the economic arm for the Tahltan people. So that's how we're organized.
And maybe I can, and I'll just add to that there is a difference, of course, in the communities in Peru. There's a number of communities in the area, but they're all fairly small communities. The one community that is in negotiating this agreement is about 1,000, 1,200 people, so it's fairly small. It's grown because of the mining. The rest of the communities are very small, from 60 families to 500 families. I mean, they're pretty small, and so it is easier, of course, to negotiate if you have strong leadership, of course, and that's always the challenge. But to negotiate with one community as opposed to what the Tahltans have, which is 3 communities in their nation, and as Jerry always likes to say, that you get 2 Tahltans in a room and you leave with 3 opinions. Well, that's definitely the case across the board. But at the same time, you can't implement a big contract like this with just one community that's small and has limited businesses and employees. These are big contracts, and you're going to need a big team. So what we started doing early on was working to bridge the divide, not only between industry and the communities, but within the communities themselves, because these communities had a history of conflict amongst each other. And so on our trips to Canada, we would make a point to invite 1 or 2 leaders from each community so that they could spend a week together and start building those partnerships between themselves, so that when it came time to actually start implementing this contract, that they could work better together and have a stronger corporate enterprise to be able to present to deliver services.
Great. Other questions?
Yes, hi, this is Sam from Canada.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, are you
or maybe better. Try again.
Yes, I had a question just about the legal entity. So how does you go about in the DB in Peru? How does one form a legal entity out of a community? And can that be replicated in most contexts?
I can't hear the question.
Yes. So, John, you'll have to get closer to your mic or something. Or maybe, John, are you typing now?
So, sorry, did you say how does a community form a legal entity in Peru? Yes. And is that doable in other contexts? Yeah, I mean, in Peru right now, the local community enterprises are legally not corporate entities. They don't have the corporate entity status, but they can create a corporation like anything else. I mean, that's the whole separation of church and state that I was talking about, where the Tahltan Nation Development Corporation is a corporation separate from its council. And that's really important. A number of years ago, Jerry had done a study on why Aboriginal businesses fail, and the majority of them fail, like 90%, I think it was, because of political interference. And so one of the biggest challenges is just showing communities, and specifically Indigenous communities, who typically have very strong political governance systems, but not separate economic governance systems. And so looking at Aboriginal economic development corporations as models that are corporate entities, but that are able to still serve community interests. So in economic development corporations in Canada, just briefly, the shareholders are the community members rather than shareholders. And so it has a slightly different structure, but that still parallels very nicely with, community governance models. In much of Latin America. And I mean, it could be a co-op, it could be a different corporate entity. It doesn't have to be a corporation. It could be a cooperative or any kind of entity. I know those are very popular in Colombia, depending on what the community wants to achieve. But definitely separating church and state and having a separate corporate entity is vital to be able to have a strong partnership with a company that you may want to provide services with, and being able to bid on big contracts as a corporation. So yes, I think it's definitely doable. Obviously, every country has its own legal system, but any entity can incorporate as a business, right?
Great.
Jeff, may I ask a question? This is Javier.
Of course.
Yeah, no, I really like the story that we heard from Jerry, and I think it's interesting also to explore the possibilities of replicating somehow the knowledge and the experience of the Tahltan people in the with these communities in the case of Peru, as Sonia explained. I have more like, I think it's general question. It's not very specific in terms of, it's more a reflection on the experience and comparing a little bit the context, which is, I was trying to define somehow what is really the core of the model from the Tahltan Nation. And because I really like this success story in terms of really growing from what you have shared with us like 20 or 30 years ago to what you have today. It's really impressive. I wonder whether really the key on that model was the joint venture model for building capacity, or maybe I think what is really at the core of this model is how to really build a nation. Because I think it's more a process of nation building than capacity building. And because also I think it was really key to have a strong leverage in terms of negotiating the initial agreements to do that work. So the way I see this more is like you have a nation building process, and in parallel you have like your business vehicle or the business instrument of the nation, and that is really to me when I think on the communities in Peru, it's very very much different in terms of what you would find around these mining projects, because in most of the cases even the mine is the one that is defining the communities. It's not like you have an area where you can identify clearly the indigenous groups or the nation, and then that's where the business comes and they interact with the community. So I see that the challenge in Peru would be very much on how to achieve this level of cohesion, this level of coherence of behavior, of interest, and achieving these agreements and implementing that in a more aligned way as we have seen in the case of Canada.
Well, I think that you probably hit the nail on the head. Nation building as opposed to capacity building, that was our vision. We knew we needed our own money. You can't rely on Indian affairs. Today they call it self-government, and they're getting money from the government. When I was chief, I just said it's self-management. I mean, all I'm doing is managing my own poverty. So we looked at a nation-building model, and we looked off reserve. Once we had that vision, we knew we needed a whole bunch of things. We needed capacity building, we needed policies, we needed all of these things. And so you're right. In Peru, Tahltan tried to build a nation. In Peru, it's communities. But it's exactly the same. If you build that community, one community at a time, and then those two communities together, 3, 4, 5, and their district now, they bring the level up for everybody. As the old saying goes, when the water rises, all boats rise. And that's what we're hoping to do there. So even though they're not building a nation, they're doing exactly the same thing with just a little different nuance to it.
Yeah, and just to build on that, as what Jerry was saying, we started working with 3 districts. Each district has between 6 and 12 communities, and we started bringing leaders from each district to Canada together every year, and started building cohesion. Because you're right, Javier, it's really cohesion is a huge challenge. And what they started learning on their own from these trips to Canada and from other workshops we were doing, that it goes beyond just the mining. I mean, energy is a huge challenge. Any of their local businesses, their dairy plant is losing money because they're using diesel, and they don't have any sustainable energy source to actually fuel it. So they have blackouts all the time and they lose products. So it's a huge challenge, and one tiny community of 60 families is never going to be able to, attract investment to get, a renewable energy project. It'd have to be a bundle of communities. They'd have to work together. So slowly, we're just one community at a time, but also working around the fact that in order to have good education, good energy, these other services that the communities all want as part of what they want for development, they do need to start working together in order to be able to leverage what is available. And so they're starting to learn that, and they've created, with our support, an association now at the provincial level that unites. Right now, there's only 12 communities involved in it in these 3 districts, but it's at the provincial level, and we have the provincial mayor involved in supporting that. And so, ultimately, the idea is to slowly start to, in parallel, support the local communities and the businesses, but also support the cohesion at a higher level in order to build a stronger sort of nation or province in that region. And just another example, we just came back actually 2 days ago from Ecuador, where we were invited by the Shuar Federation and Lundin Gold to look at their new Frutas del Norte project that is just starting there. And the Shuar are a huge nation there, and they're quite divided right now in terms of mining. But we had a lot of success in our initial meetings and workshops with them around that. And I think it's going to be, again, a different approach and different results in terms of using these tools. But ultimately, it's like what Jerry said, it's still ultimately the same goals.
Sonia and Jerry, there's a question in the chat right now from Emma. Do you want to take a read?
Can you read it out? I don't see it.
Okay, it says, I've really enjoyed listening to the story. The key of the message of the story is the importance of grassroots bottom-up vision. And then that said, how can companies and contractors who want to work as allies with these communities support them in developing, taking ownership of, and achieving their vision? So I guess how do the suppliers and the mining companies themselves assist with this sort of nation-building idea that we're talking about here?
Number one is get themselves a good community liaison worker. Preferably hire somebody from the nation or the community they want to work with. Number one. Number two, what the Teltan did was we hired an assistant personnel manager to work at the mine site to do 2 things. More than 2 things, sorry. One is to help with the hiring, but more importantly, they were there for the community members to talk to. Like a union has a shop steward, well, the Teltans had an assistant person, HR person to talk to. And thirdly, this person tracked the training and the advancement in whatever department they're in. Those are 2 things that would go a long ways immediately to work with the communities and to build community relations. You have to build community relations. Those are the 2 that I would do first.
Sonia?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the biggest challenges we have seen is just, especially in Peru, local procurement and community businesses is put under the sort of CSR community relations portfolio, and is not tied very well. There's a gap between communication in the CSR team and the procurement team. And so really being able to actually work together and maybe trying to bring local procurement under the umbrella, or somehow bring them together to close that gap, because a big challenge is, of course, that there needs to be at the early stages some time and investment put into developing the capacity in the communities. And so, to find out about a contract 2 days before it's coming out to bidding is not going to be helpful to support communities to participate. So really being able to have a strategy. One of the things we did early on with Hafe was develop a long-term strategy for them as well, so that there was a strategy and somehow cohesion between the procurement and the CSR team, that they were aligned and that there was eye to eye on how they were going to move this forward, because ultimately there needs to be sort of a lot of communication.
Great. Well, we probably have time for one more question. So.
Okay, Jeff, I have one. If yeah, this is Etienne Lamy from Rio Tinto.
Okay.
I'm particularly interested in the Canadian piece, and what I'm hearing here basically is that we have two exceptional leaders, that are very modest. And yes, you share your experience. Jerry, you mentioned about the vision, the methodology, and having a proper vehicle to implement your vision. But it seems to me that this exceptional visionary leadership is what has been cementing this and helping, your nation to achieve all what you've been able to achieve. And based on my very personal and modest experience is that this exceptional leadership is in scarce supply on the market and in many communities, unfortunately. And I wonder, what comes first and to what extent you can, replicate models without having this key sort of a inner drive, that can actually, help your peoples and communities to go through, the ups and downs of that will naturally occur when you're trying to implement, significant changes such as those we've been talking about. Because I work here in Canada, mostly in Eastern Canada, with communities in Quebec, Labrador, and Newfoundland, and you can see significant differences, and you can almost predict, that some of them will be successful, maybe not as much as the Tahltan, but they just have the right people, and others, they're going to keep struggling, as you said, Jerry. Maybe they're locked into this INAC mindset, and it's just, fighting politically, but you don't see the the drive, the economic drive, and you wonder where this will lead them, So, yeah, this is, I guess it's less of a question more than observation, and I just want to really, I have to say, to both Sonia and Jerry, this is exceptional, and I hope we'll have opportunities to chat offline about these, your achievements. Thank you.
Okay, you're absolutely right about some of the things you said. The first thing that has to happen, though, is communities have to know what's possible. That's why I go out and I tell my story. And I say, look, and I do it in Canada. I was up in Kuujjuaq. I spoke at the Quebec Mining Conference. I mean, I've been all over Canada doing this stuff. But the thing about it is, people have to understand what's possible. Once they see what's possible, then they start asking questions. How do we make this happen here? And so really, that's the key. They need to see what's possible. They have to understand this is possible. There's a better way of doing things. Mining companies do understand them. I spoke at Mine Ministers Conference. I was the first Aboriginal to ever speak at the Mine Ministers Conference, and I did it for the first 8 years before anybody else spoke. So even the mine minister had to understand what was possible. And now these things are happening more and more, but the information has to get out. I helped write a document called the Tahltan Aboriginal Toolkit back in 2006 with Natural Resources Canada, Indian Affairs, MAC, PDAC, and the Canadian Aboriginal Minerals Association, and I was vice president. And we won the national award for the best Aboriginal mine training document in Canada that year. Next year, UNESCO gave us the award for the best Aboriginal mine training document in the world. And that document is available through MAC, PDAC, Indian Affairs, Natural Resources Canada. But it gives the community the background, a base to understand mining, because we did exploration, construction, operation, reclamation, closure. And it doesn't make mining engineers out of you, but at least it gives them enough information to ask the right questions. And further to that, it gives them real ammunition to combat the NGOs, half-truths, etc., etc. And so these are kind of things that they need. They need information. Mining companies really have to work at it. And truth be told, they're not doing a very good job.
Great. I think,
Yeah, so
Sonia, do you have
that's,
anything quickly to add? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, I think Jerry's so adamant and passionate about sharing information, because really that is some of the biggest hurdles we see both in Canada and around the world. It's just misinformation and not having information. And information and knowledge is power, or it's the first step of power. Being able to actually know how to implement it is power. And so, one of the very first things that we recommend and we do is these 2-day workshops on understanding mining and the mining cycle, and what does it mean, and how does it look like, and how to ask the right questions, and how to even know where you're going and what you want to achieve. And some of the getting back to basics and setting the foundations to be able to have these long-term successful partnerships, because oftentimes companies jump into trying to deliver services and get communities involved and sign agreements without really making sure that the communities have strong foundations and a strong base to even be able to move forward in that.
Mm-hmm.
So thank
Great.
you for that question.
Great. Well, we're about 90 minutes, so we're going to wrap it up. Really, really inspiring stuff. Been really wanting to do this for a while, to have you talk this story, and I'm really glad to hear, Jerry, that you're on the road, continuing to spread the story and showing that it can be done. And it's really exciting to hear what you're doing, Sonia and Jerry, now trying to spread that word to other parts of the world. So we'll leave it there. Just a quick reminder that we'll post a summary of this on the World Bank Ed-led Community Practice, and then hopefully we can have some more questions there. And really look forward to continuing the discussion there. And thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Sonia.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry and Sonia. Fantastic.
Thank you.